The silence of the high country was a physical thing, a weight that settled in a man's bones and stayed there. Cole knew its shape and its texture. He had lived with it long enough to consider it the only honest neighbor he had. His cabin was a small stone and timber assertion against the vast, swallowing emptiness of the mountains, a place of methodical habits and unspoken griefs. The fire in the hearth was his clock, its slow consumption of pine and oak the only measure of the passing days. He moved with the quiet economy of a man who conserves everything, his words, his warmth, his thoughts. The floorboards, worn smooth by his solitary pacing, barely creaked beneath his weight. Outside, the snow fell in a thick, hypnotic curtain, burying the world in a shroud of white, muffling every sound until the only thing left was the low whisper of the wind under the eaves and the steady beat of his own heart. He was cleaning a rifle on the rough-hewn table, his hands moving with a familiar, practiced grace. The metallic scent of oil and steel was a sharp counterpoint to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. Each component was laid out on a piece of buckskin, a small mechanical congregation he understood better than he had ever understood the communion of people. This was his world, simple, ordered, and contained. He had built these walls not just to keep the winter out, but to keep the memory of a louder, more complicated world at bay. Here there were no judgments, no expectations, only the clear, cold logic of survival. The sun was a pale smear in the gray sky, offering light but no heat, and the shadows in the cabin were growing long. He finished his work, reassembling the rifle with a final, satisfying click, and placed it back on the rack above the mantelpiece. He stood for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling its familiar embrace. It was a lonely peace, but it was peace nonetheless, an arrangement he had made with the wilderness and with himself. The sound, when it came, was so alien it felt like a violation. It wasn't the scrape of a branch or the call of a predator. It was the frantic, desperate drumming of fists against his door. Cole froze, every muscle tensed. No one came here. The trail was difficult in summer and nearly impassable now. A trader might come by twice a year, but never in a storm, and never with such panicked urgency. He moved away from the firelight, melting into the deeper shadows of the room, his hand resting on the heavy iron poker by the hearth. The pounding came again, faster this time, punctuated by a thin, breathless cry that was nearly stolen by the wind. It was a woman's voice. He approached the door with a predator's stillness, his body a coiled spring of caution. He had learned long ago that desperation could be as dangerous as malice. He slid the heavy bolt, the sound a loud crack in the oppressive quiet, and opened the door just enough to peer through the gap. The cold rushed in, a physical blow. And then he saw her. She was a ghost made of snow and fear, her face pale and stark against the dark fall of her hair, which was wet and matted. She wore a traditional gray dress, a cheongsam, that was torn at the shoulder and impossibly thin for the brutal cold. Her feet, he saw with a jolt that went deeper than the chill, were bare, already blue and bleeding against the fresh snow that had gathered on his porch. In her arms she clutched a small bundle wrapped in a flimsy blanket, a child, his face hidden. Her eyes, wide and dark, locked onto his. They held a terror so profound it seemed to have burned away everything else. "They want to hurt me," she whispered, her voice a ragged tremor, the words turning to frost in the air between them. "Please, please help." His first instinct was to close the door. It was a cold, hard impulse born of years of self-imposed exile. Her trouble was not his. The world and its endless, messy conflicts were what he had come here to escape. He could see the tracks behind her, already beginning to fade under the steady snowfall. More than one set of prints. She had been pursued. Bringing her in meant bringing her trouble in with her. He looked from her terrified face to the small, still form in her arms. The blanket shifted, and for a second he saw the child's face, small and pale, his eyes closed. A pang of something old and deeply buried, a feeling he had tried to freeze to death, stirred within him. It was not pity. It was a stark, brutal recognition of vulnerability. To turn her away was not a choice for solitude. It was a sentence of death. Not for her, not for the child, not on his mountain. He made the decision without another thought, the way a man decides to breathe. He opened the door wider, his large frame filling the space, a sudden shield against the wind and whatever followed her. "Come in," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't offer a hand. He simply stepped back, creating a space for them to enter. She stumbled across the threshold, nearly collapsing from the sudden shift from biting cold to enveloping warmth. She leaned against the wall, shivering violently, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The child in her arms stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Cole shut the door, the heavy wood thudding into place, and slid the bolt home. The sound was one of finality. The outside world was shut out. Her trouble was now inside his walls. He turned to face her, the firelight catching the tremor in her hands, the raw, scraped skin of her feet. He said nothing more, just moved to the hearth, stoked the fire until it blazed, and then took a thick wool blanket from a nearby chest. He didn't drape it over her, a gesture that might feel too intimate, too forward. He simply held it out. She stared at it for a moment, as if she didn't understand, before her hands reached for it, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was as cold as ice. She huddled by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, the child now nestled in her lap, also swaddled in wool. The boy, whose name she whispered was Leanne, was no more than 4 or 5, his eyes huge and dark as he watched Cole with a silent, unnerving intensity. The woman, May, did not speak for a long time. She just shivered, the tremors slowly subsiding as the heat from the hearth seeped into her bones. Cole brought her a tin cup of warm water, not coffee or anything stronger, just something to chase the deep chill. She took it with both hands, her gaze fixed on the flames. He took a seat at the table, a deliberate distance away, giving her space to breathe, to feel safe. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but a fragile, tense silence filled with unspoken fear and the faint, rhythmic sound of the child's breathing. Finally she looked at him, her eyes shadowed with a shame that was not her own. "They work for the railroad," she said, her voice low and halting. "My husband, he took a loan from the foreman to bring us here." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. "He died. An accident. The foreman, Mr. Corbett, he said the debt was not cleared. He said I was part of the payment." The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Cole felt a familiar, cold anger settle in his gut. It was an old story, one of power and predation, dressed up in the language of contracts and debts. He had seen it 100 times in the world he'd left behind. "He came to my home, with his men," she continued, her voice barely a whisper now. "I took Leanne and I ran." She looked down at her feet, which he could see were swollen and discolored. He stood without a word and went to a small chest where he kept medical supplies. He came back with a basin of warm water, some clean rags, and a jar of salve. He knelt before her, not looking at her face, but at her injured feet. She flinched, pulling back instinctively. "Still," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He gently took one of her feet in his large, calloused hands and lowered it into the water. She gasped at the contact, a mix of pain and relief. He cleaned the cuts with a methodical gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. It was an act of profound, unspoken tenderness. He was not healing a wound. He was acknowledging her humanity, cleaning away the filth of another man's cruelty. When he was done, he wrapped her feet in clean bandages. He rose and returned to the table. The small domestic act had shifted something between them. The space was no longer just his. It was a shared sanctuary. He knew this sanctuary was temporary. Corbett and his men would not give up. They would be searching. And this cabin, his fortress, was the only thing standing in their way. He would need more supplies if they were to be holed up for any length of time. The thought of going to the settlement, of leaving them alone, was a risk, but a necessary one. The next morning, under a sky the color of slate, he prepared to leave. "Bolt the door behind me," he told her. "Don't open it for anyone, no matter what you hear." May nodded, her eyes wide with a renewed flicker of fear. She held Leanne close, her hand resting protectively on his head. "We will be safe," she said, though it sounded more like a question, a desperate hope. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then stepped out into the biting cold. The settlement was a few miles down the mountain, a small, grim collection of buildings huddled against the elements. It was a place of necessity, not community. As he walked through the single muddy street, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. The town chorus was tuning up. Whispers followed him like his own shadow. At the general store, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, Mrs. Gable, watched him over her spectacles as he gathered flour, salt, and beans. "Getting ready for a long winter, Cole?" she asked, her voice laced with a pointed curiosity. "Always," he replied, his tone flat, offering nothing. "Heard there was some trouble up at the Chinese camp," she pressed on, wiping an already clean counter. "Something about that foreman, Corbett, looking for runaway property." The word property was a deliberate sting. Cole's jaw tightened. He placed his items on the counter, his movements slow and controlled. He didn't look at her. He looked past her, through the window, where he saw Corbett and two of his men standing outside the saloon. They were watching the store, watching him. Corbett was a big man, but his size was soft, the kind that came from bullying, not labor. He had a swagger that was meant to project power, but only revealed a deep-seated insecurity. Their eyes met through the grimy glass. There was no mistaking the possessive fury in Corbett's stare, or the cold, unyielding warning in Cole's. The silent challenge had been made. Cole paid for his supplies, his gaze never wavering from the men outside. He was no longer just a man buying flour. He was a protector, a guardian, and he had just publicly declared his position. The walk back to the cabin was heavy with foreboding. The whispers of the town followed him up the mountain, a venomous cloud of rumor and judgment. They would have twisted the story already, painting him as a thief, an interferer, the kind of man who takes what isn't his. They would paint May not as a desperate mother fleeing for her life, but as something sullied, something owned and stolen. The town's morality was a fickle and cruel thing, always siding with the loudest voice, the biggest fist. He knew it was only a matter of time before that judgment came knocking, and it would wear a badge. Sure enough, late the next afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the trail below the cabin. Cole watched from the window, his hand resting on the doorframe. It was the town's lawman, Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was as soft as his belly. Miller was a creature of consensus. His authority derived not from the law, but from his ability to avoid offending powerful men like Corbett. He reined in his horse a good 50 yards from the cabin, as if hesitant to get too close. "Cole," he called out, his voice thin in the vast quiet. "Need a word." Cole stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door slightly ajar. He didn't invite the sheriff closer. He stood there, a silent, immovable object, and waited. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Cole, I'm not here to cause any trouble," he began, the classic opening of a man about to do just that. "But people are talking. Corbett's been in my office. Says you're holding something of his. Something that belongs to the railroad company." Cole's expression did not change. His silence was a wall, forcing the sheriff to fill it with more nervous words. "He's talking about the Chinese woman. Says her husband died owing a significant debt. Says she's collateral." Miller couldn't quite meet Cole's eyes. "Look, whatever the truth of it is, it ain't your affair. You're making things difficult. Corbett's got the company behind him. It's best for everyone if you just let him handle his business." "Is a woman his business?" Cole asked, his voice low and gravelly, each word carefully chosen. "Is a child?" The sheriff flushed, a dull red creeping up his neck. "That's not for me to say. It's a contractual matter, a private dispute. The law doesn't get involved in such things." "The law," Cole repeated, the words tasting like ash. He looked past Miller, to the cold, indifferent peaks of the mountains. The law was what men like Miller and Corbett made it, a tool to protect the powerful and punish the weak. "Tell Corbett to stay off my land," Cole said. It wasn't a request. "Now, Cole, don't be making threats," Miller warned, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. "That wasn't a threat," Cole replied, his gaze finally snapping back to the sheriff, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "It's a boundary. He's not welcome here. You can tell him that's my only word on the matter." Miller held his gaze for a moment, then seemed to shrink. He saw the unbending certainty in Cole's eyes and knew there was no persuasion to be had. He nodded curtly, tugged on his reins, and turned his horse around, riding away without another word. Cole watched him go, the lone figure diminishing against the snow. The law had come and gone. It had offered no protection, no justice. It had only delivered a warning. They were truly alone now. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was an island, and the tide of malice was rising. He spent the next day securing the cabin, not out of fear, but out of a grim sense of pragmatism. He checked the window shutters, stacked extra firewood on the porch, and ensured the water barrels were full. Every action was deliberate, a quiet preparation for a siege he knew was inevitable. Inside, a fragile peace had taken root. May had begun to help with small tasks, moving with a quiet grace that seemed to fill the small space. She mended a tear in one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat, an act of quiet reciprocity. Leanne, the boy, had started to speak, his voice a soft, musical counterpoint to the cabin's usual silence. He would ask Cole simple questions. "Is the fire hot? Is the snow cold?" Cole would answer with a simple yes, a gruffness in his tone that couldn't quite hide a thawing tenderness. The boy was a small, warm presence in a world that had been cold for so long. One evening, after a simple meal of stew and hard bread, Cole was outside, splitting the last of a log as the light failed. The air was still and frigid, each breath a cloud of white. As he returned to the cabin, he saw it. Pinned to the rough wood of his door by the point of a hunting knife was a piece of tanned leather. Scrawled on it in what looked like charcoal was a single, crudely drawn symbol. A brand, the one the railroad company used for its livestock. Beneath it, one word. Mine. The air went out of his lungs. This was different from the sheriff's weaselly warnings or the whispers in town. This was a direct claim, a violation of his threshold. It was Corbett's voice, made tangible and sharp. He pulled the knife from the wood, its blade cold and heavy in his hand. He looked out into the darkening woods, at the deep shadows pooling between the pines. They had been here, close enough to touch his home. The sense of being watched was a physical pressure at the back of his neck. He stepped back inside, closing and bolting the door. He didn't show the piece of leather to May. He didn't want to bring that ugliness into the fragile warmth they had built. But she saw the change in him. She saw the new tension in his shoulders, the hard set of his jaw as he stared into the fire. The countdown had begun. The silence in the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was the held breath before a storm. The threat was no longer a distant rumor. It was nailed to their door. That night the weather turned. The wind began to moan through the pines, a low, mournful sound that slowly grew into a relentless shriek. Snow, which had been falling gently for days, was now driven horizontally in thick, blinding sheets. A blizzard was descending upon the mountain, a furious white rage that matched the cold fury in Cole's heart. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a swirling chaos of wind and snow. The storm was a wall, cutting them off completely. It was both a prison and a shield. No one could get to them, but they could not escape. They were trapped with the coming violence. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a defiant bastion of light and warmth against the elemental chaos. The wind hammered at the walls, and the shutters rattled as if a great beast was trying to claw its way in. Leanne, startled by the noise, had crawled into his mother's lap, his small face buried in her shoulder. May hummed a soft, low lullaby, a melody that was both sad and resilient, a thread of human tenderness against the storm's fury. Cole stood by the window, peering through a small gap in the shutter at the maelstrom outside. He could see nothing but a churning vortex of white. Corbett would come in this. He was the kind of man who would use the cover of a storm, thinking it would add to the terror, that it would make his arrival seem like an act of nature itself, an inevitable, unstoppable force. May looked up at him, her song fading. "He will come tonight," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Cole answered, his voice calm. There was no fear in her eyes now. The terror that had driven her to his door had been replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. It was the look of a person who had been pushed to the very edge and had found solid ground there. She had nothing left to lose but her son, and for him, she would be unbreakable. "I am not afraid," she said softly, her hand stroking Leanne's hair. "Not here, with you." The simple declaration landed in the center of the room, more powerful than the raging storm. It was a statement of trust, of faith, a bond forged in shared peril. Cole turned from the window and looked at her, at the fierce protective love in her eyes as she held her child. In that moment, he felt the last of the ice around his own heart crack. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was a guardian, a shield. He made a silent vow, not to her, but to the quiet, determined spirit of the family huddled by his fire. Not just that they would survive the night, but that they would see the dawn with their dignity intact. The pounding on the door when it finally came was heavier and more brutal than the storm. It was the sound of fists and booted feet, a furious, impatient violence that sought to shatter the peace within. Leanne whimpered and pressed closer to his mother. May's arms tightened around him, but her gaze, fixed on Cole, was steady. Cole moved to the door, his steps measured, deliberate. He did not pick up his rifle. This was not a fight to be had at a distance. This was a line to be drawn, a moral stand to be made at his own threshold. He slid the bolt and opened the door, stepping out onto the small porch and pulling the door closed behind him, leaving May and Leanne in the sanctuary of the cabin. The wind and snow tore at him, a physical assault. 3 figures stood there, barely visible through the blizzard, their forms dark and hulking. Corbett was in the center, his face red and raw from the cold, his eyes glittering with a feverish rage. "Evening, Cole," he snarled, his voice a raw bellow against the wind. "I've come for my property." 2 other men flanked him, their faces mean and drawn. They were armed, but their hands were buried in their pockets against the cold. "There's no property here," Cole said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the storm's howl. He stood with his feet planted, his body a solid, unmoving barrier between them and his home. "Don't play games with me," Corbett spat, taking a step forward. "I want the woman. She's company debt. Everyone knows it. The law knows it." "She is a mother, with her son," Cole stated, the simple facts a stark rebuttal to Corbett's language of ownership. "She owes nothing. You are on my land. Leave." Corbett laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your land? This whole mountain answers to the railroad, old man, and so do you. Now step aside before we move you." He gestured to his men, who began to spread out, flanking Cole. The fight was a blur of brutal motion. It was not elegant. It was clumsy, desperate, and vicious, fought in the blinding snow on a narrow porch. Cole met the first man's rush with a solid blow that sent him stumbling back into a snowdrift. The second came at him with a knife, the blade glinting in the faint light from the window. Cole caught his wrist, twisting it with a sharp crack of bone. The man screamed and fell back, but it was Corbett who was fueled by a deeper, more personal rage. He charged, his bulk a battering ram, and slammed Cole against the cabin wall. The wood groaned under the impact. Corbett's face was inches from his, contorted with fury and humiliation. "She shamed me," he roared, his breath hot and foul. "She ran! No one does that to me!" He rained blows down on Cole, driven by wounded pride. Cole absorbed them, his body taking the punishment, his will unbending. He was fighting for more than himself. He was fighting for the warmth and light behind him, for the quiet dignity of the family he had taken in. As they grappled, the cabin door opened. May stood there, framed in the warm yellow light, holding a heavy iron skillet. Leanne was behind her, his small hand clutching her dress. She was not crying. Her face was set, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire that the storm itself could not extinguish. "I am not a debt," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing out over the wind. "I am not your property. I am a mother." The words struck Corbett with more force than any physical blow. He froze, his fist raised, and turned to look at her. In that moment of hesitation, Cole found his strength. It was not a surge of rage, but a cold, focused certainty. He drove his shoulder hard into Corbett's chest, throwing him off balance. Corbett staggered backward, slipping on the icy porch, and fell hard into the snow. The fight was over. His men were down, and his authority, built on bluster and fear, had crumbled. Cole stood over him, breathing heavily, the snow melting on his bruised face. Corbett lay in the snow, defeated, the bravado washed away, leaving only a pathetic, sputtering rage. The two other men were nursing their injuries, their appetite for the fight gone. The storm howled, a witness to the raw, primal confrontation. Cole had the man at his mercy. The knife from the second man lay nearby in the snow. It would be easy to end it, to answer violence with finality, to ensure this man could never threaten them again. It was the law of the frontier, the simple, brutal math of survival. He could feel the temptation, the dark pull of revenge. But then he looked back at the doorway. He saw May, standing tall, and Leanne, peering out from behind her, his eyes wide. He was not just a fighter, he was a protector. And protection was not about vengeance. It was about creating a space for peace, for safety, for a future. Killing Corbett would only mire them deeper in the world of violence he was trying to keep at bay. It would make him a murderer in the boy's eyes. He chose a different path. Not weakness, but a strength that Corbett could never understand. "The storm will break by dawn," Cole said, his voice steady, absolute. "When it does, I'm taking you to the federal marshal in the next county. Not Miller, a real lawman. You'll answer for this, for what you did to her husband, for what you tried to do to her." Corbett stared up at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. He had expected a killing blow, not a promise of justice. This was a language he didn't speak. To be subjected to the law, to be held accountable by an authority greater than his own small tyranny, was a fate worse than a quick death. It was the complete destruction of his power. Cole retrieved the knife and used it to cut strips from a rope on the porch. He bound Corbett's hands and then those of his men, his movements efficient and final. He would not kill them. He would force them to face the consequences of their actions in the world of men, not settle it in the dark like animals. He had won, not by being more brutal, but by holding fast to a principle. He had drawn a line at his threshold and defended it not just with his fists, but with his certainty. He had chosen dignity over dominance, justice over revenge. He herded the three men into the small, cold shed where he stored his tools and extra wood, locking the heavy door behind them. They would be safe enough from the storm, left to contemplate their defeat in the dark. When he re-entered the cabin, the warmth was a welcome embrace. The silence that greeted him was one of awe and exhaustion. May stood where he had left her, the skillet still in her hand. She slowly lowered it, placing it on the table, the metallic sound loud in the sudden quiet. Her eyes searched his face, taking in the bruises, the cut on his cheek. He was battered, but he was unbroken. He walked to the fire, his body aching, and sank into the chair, the fatigue hitting him all at once. May came to him, not with words, but with the basin of warm water and the clean rags, just as he had done for her. She knelt and began to gently clean the blood from his face. Her touch was soft, a quiet act of care that spoke more than any words of gratitude could. It was a perfect reversal of their first real interaction, a closing of a circle. They were no longer rescuer and victim, but equals, partners in a shared struggle. Leanne, who had watched the entire confrontation from the doorway with a child's unfiltered gaze, slowly approached. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth gray stone he must have found by the hearth. He held it out to Cole. Cole looked down at the small offering in the boy's palm. He slowly raised his aching arm and opened his hand. Leanne carefully placed the stone into it. It was a simple, profound gesture of trust, of acceptance. The boy was no longer afraid of him. He saw him not as a fearsome stranger, but as a protector. Cole closed his fingers around the stone, its smooth coolness a comfort against his skin. He looked from the boy's earnest face to May's, her eyes shining in the firelight. In this small, battered cabin, in the heart of a raging storm, something new had been forged. Not a romance, not a promise, but a fragile, unspoken bond. A family of a kind. They sat there for a long time, the three of them, listening to the storm as it slowly began to spend its fury. The wind's shriek softened to a moan, then a whisper. A quiet peace settled over the room, an earned peace that felt more solid and real than anything Cole had known for years. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the shutters, Cole stood and looked out the window. The snow had stopped. The world was blanketed in a pristine, unbroken white. It was beautiful, but he knew the calm was deceptive. Taking Corbett to the marshal was the right thing to do, but it wouldn't be the end. The railroad company had long arms and a short memory for justice. The town's prejudice would not simply melt away with the snow. The fight for their safety was over, but the struggle for their place in this hard land, for a life of peace and dignity, was just beginning. He felt May come to stand beside him. They looked out at the dawn together, not speaking, but sharing a silent understanding of the long road that lay ahead. And for the first time in a very long time, Cole did not feel like he had to walk it alone.